The views and opinions expressed on this show are purely the views and opinions of the person who made them, and do not necessarily reflect or agree with those of the show's commercial sponsors, its radio station affiliates, or internet broadcast platforms. As the restriction on our God-given right to free speech manifests itself throughout the world, we are inspired by Jesus Christ's immortal words, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And we reserve the rights to all our words. Thank you, and now enjoy the show.
But here's the thing. Our country has sunken to such a moral low that today we have the candidate for vice president of the United States of America as a literal whore. A literal whore. You say, what do you mean? What's a literal whore? Isn't a literal whore a woman who sells their body and prostitutes their body, and they give gifts to all whores? Isn't that what the Bible says? That's a Bible verse. I know you like Bible verses like Jesus wept and for God so loved the world, but here's another Bible verse. They give gifts to all whores. It's in Ezekiel chapter 16. That's the Bible too. And let me tell you something. She is a literal whore. You know how that woman, Kamala Harris, you know how she got started in politics? She got started in her late 20s sleeping with a married man who was 60 years old. And then he appointed her to political office. Let that sink in for a moment. Here you have a woman in her late 20s, goes to bed with a 60-year-old man. You think she's just really into 60-year-olds? And then that 60-year-old man, the mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, just happened to appoint her to political office. That's how she got her start in politics, by being a literal whore. And this is not some wild conspiracy theory. This is mainstream media. This is a fact. This is a known, open fact that this woman has committed whoredom to get where she is today, and the so-called feminists of our nation are rejoicing. Folks, how is that? Can somebody explain to me how that elevates women? Hey, little girls, you want to succeed and be a great person someday like Kamala Harris? Just find some 60-year-old, dirty old man to be your sugar daddy, and you can be whatever you want. You could even be the president of the United States. And folks, you know what? If she's the vice president, then that's one heartbeat away from being the president. I mean, Joe Biden's got one foot in the grave. His brain's already there.
To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticise. You are listening to ACH. I'm Andy, your host, and before we start today's show, I would like to thank James for his recent donation. If you are able to help keep the show on the air, then please go to achshow.com and you can buy a book or make a donation. So thank you so much for that. So anyway, today is Monday, so it's time for the Limeys for a show entitled Electric Limey Land with my co-host Maleficus Scott. So let's bring him up right now. Maleficus, are you with me?
I'm here, Andy. Yeah, it's great to be back, and yeah, that's a nice twist on a good album. I like it.
It's funny, we've actually got our own virtual venue that I've just dropped in our Skype chat that looks like a bar. Someone's already graffitied on the side of it, which is a bit annoying, but that'll be our show image today. And we are also delighted to be joined again for a consecutive week by our very special guest, Frank Raymond. So let's bring him up right now. Frank, are you with us?
Adsum, master, the slave of the lamp is at your command.
Wonderful. And folks, Frank is in Canada, And after Justin Trudeau's recent troubled election campaign, which he ended up winning, surprise, surprise, during the campaign some of Trudeau's gaps were coming up, including his decision to don blackface back in 2001, I believe. If I had any desire to help Justin Trudeau out, I would have had no hesitation in advising him to do a parody of Tom Petty's I Won't Back Down for his election campaign, which would obviously instead have been entitled I Won't Black Up. Unfortunately, neither Trudeau, nor his campaign team had the intellectual fortitude to come up with this, and who can blame them, as he won anyway. But Frank, in this instance, you're the Limeys on-the-ground Canadian political reporter, so what say you about Trudeau and his recent election victory? Over to you, Frank.
Well, first of all, let me greet you. Maleficus, you're a patriot and a man of integrity. Andy, you're an indefatigable fighter. You are both merry men in the tradition of Robin Hood, so I greet you with the traditional English welcome of merry meet. And I offer a blessing. May the fur on your toes never fall out.
Excellent.
That's a wonderful blessing, and I hope that comes to fruition.
Time will tell.
Time will tell, indeed.
You're asking about Justin Trudeau. All I'll say is that every time I see the man's silly, smirking face and his mincing, prancing manner, I have this irresistible, powerful desire to kick his backside. And I'm not the only one. Almost everyone I know has the same emotion and drive. They want to kick his backside. And yet you notice that he still gets elected, that this is the best that the occupation, that the white peoples can get. Traitors, cowards, a man whose only the only job he ever held was that of ski instructor and dance instructor, I believe. Ski instructor, certainly. He never ran a business. He never had a responsible job. In fact, I would say that he and his ilk, all the other so-called leaders of the white world, all these puppets, all these traitors, they are so inept, so lacking in maturity, so lacking in any kind of administrative experience. They could not organize a drink up in a brewery or a rape in a whorehouse. And yet there they are, sitting in office and pontificating.
Yes, absolutely, and it is interesting. More and more people, normies now, as we would call them, are saying, all these leaders around the world, they're obviously all marionettes dancing to a tune of someone else, and they can all see it now. They know that there's a greater power in charge, and I think that this is worrying the elite. But let's move on to the clip that you just heard during the show intro segment, which was of Pastor Stephen L. Anderson, the full YouTube of which will be available, and that's a video, folks, will be available in the post for the show at andrewcarringtonhitchcock.com. Pastor Stephen is certainly not backward in coming forward. Indeed, on his website, faithfulwordbaptist.org, that's faithfulwordbaptist.org, the first paragraph states, and I quote, "We are a local New Testament church reaching the Phoenix area with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Don't expect anything contemporary or liberal. We are an old-fashioned, independent, fundamental, King James Bible only, soul-winning Baptist church." Well, good on you, Pastor Stephen. I appreciate your faith and your honesty. Maleficus, any comments on that clip? And then please can you hand over to Frank for his?
He certainly pulled no punches, and I like people that are just able to straight talk. He got a few laughs as well from the audience, which I thought was, that one of the best ways of putting things across and making things stick in people's minds is either it being a very impactful truth or a bit of humor, and there was both thrown in there. So yeah, I enjoyed listening. That's the second time I've listened to that, actually, and yeah, the second time round it was funnier.
I have nothing to add to that. I think Maleficus has dealt with that adequately.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Maleficus. So just a couple more bits before we hand the show over to Frank for a continuation of last week's show. A couple of announcements. As you know, you can now access my website via achshow.com, but I've also just purchased andyhitchcock.com, which will also take you to my website. It's just trying to find things that are easier to remember. For example, when I'm on with David Duke every Tuesday, he always refers to me as Andy Hitchcock. He says, look him up online, Andy Hitchcock, and I don't imagine that you would find me online even with this new .com name, but it's easier to convey to people. andyhitchcock.com, achshow.com, whatever's easier for you. And secondly, and this is the most important thing I'm going to say on today's show, whilst my dear friend and publisher of moneytreepublishing.com, Dave Gahari, was improving from his COVID diagnosis, he sadly took a turn for the worse, and at the weekend he was placed on a ventilator. His condition is improving though, so again I ask you to pray for Dave at this difficult time. Have a look at moneytreepublishing.com, folks. I'm not telling you to buy anything, just have a look, and many of the items on there you will be familiar with, even though this is the only venue that offers them now. Dave Gahari works tirelessly to provide books and videos. The powers that should not be, have done everything in their power to take out of circulation. So again, if, like me, you appreciate what he has done on behalf of standing up for the underdog, please stand up for him now in your prayers. And if you haven't prayed before and you're a bit worried about praying for yourself and what have you, you could pray for Dave and, just try that out and see if it works for you. We're not going to do any Strange Bedfellows this week because I want to devote as much time as possible to Frank's presentation, but we're still going to do the figures, and that's the weekly report on the latest deaths and injuries from the vaccines in the UK. These are from the British government's website page entitled Coronavirus COVID-19 Vaccine Adverse Reactions, and are aggregated from the totals of the 4 vaccine analysis prints linked to on that page. With regard to the figures available today, we have a total of 1,662 people having died and 363,676 people having been injured after taking the vaccine. Last week we had a total of 1,645 people having died and 361,112 people having been injured after taking the vaccine. So in a week we've gone up, 17 people on deaths and about 2,500 people on the injuries. So I think it's slowing down, but of course any death and any injury is going to be tragic for the friends and families of those people. So we'll leave it at that, and let's go over now to Frank. Frank, where would you like to start us off today?
Well, the last time we spoke, I was stressing the fact, let me first respond to some emails that I received. The emails that I received, generally good, but among them, quite a few said that I had mentioned Jew supremacists, and that was a thinly veiled attack at the entire Jewish people. I don't know how much more clearly I can say this. I know so many Jews. I have worked with them. I have been a tutor to them. And I know that the mass of the Jewish people are no different from you and me and everyone else, hardworking. They just want to get along. They just want to make a life for themselves. They may not have the same spiritualities as white people or as brown people, but they are not involved in any supremacism. So when I say Jew supremacist, I mean just that, a small and evil elite that hides behind the Jewish nation. So nobody, I don't know how else I can say it, and yet I get these emails saying, you really mean to attack all the Jewish people? No, I don't. When I say Jew supremacist, I mean precisely that. And they do not serve their people well.
Yes. Frank, I always go back to this ADL competition back in 1988, in which a guy called Joseph Ribakoff won, and it was for law students in America to draft a hate speech legislation. And I've been into this in great detail in the past because I've documented it in my book, The Synagogue of Satan. What it was really designed to do, and this is what I predicted, and I don't make a lot of predictions in the book, I just report on, historical facts. But I predicted that they would use this so that the elite could hide behind the Jews as a race and say that any criticism of them is anti-Semitism and criticism of the Jewish race as a whole. So I think that the attacks that were directed at you were just this same practice. And even recently, I read it in The Guardian, they were talking about in one piece, and quoted it on this show, and that was how, people who criticised George Soros, or they mentioned the Rothschild family, they're anti-Semitic. Well, these people are identifying individuals. If someone attacks me, do I say, oh, that's an attack on all the British people? Well, it isn't. But it suits them, so it can then prevent any criticism of them, so that they realise that as they get more power, it's going to become more clear to people who's got the power. So they need to have some sort of legislation whereby they cannot be criticised for having that power. That's the way I interpret it. Back to you, Frank.
Yes, now I'll address the second point. In the last broadcast, you played a clip of a member of an ex-member of the Jewish Board of Deputies of the UK, who was speaking of Jeremy Corbyn and said, Corbyn sounds very similar to Korban, which is sacrifice, and we should sacrifice Jeremy Corbyn for all the harm he's done. Now, I know a bit more about this. The Muslims and Arabs, they use the word Qurbani. Qurbani means sacrifice, and specifically, Qurbani does mean sacrifice, but specifically they refer to the sacrifice of a sheep or a goat by Abraham. From the biblical and Torah story, that God told Abraham to sacrifice his son. At the last minute, he said, I was just testing you, go and sacrifice that goat over there, right? Now, every year, there are two big holidays. They're called Eid, E-I-D. One is the Eid al-Fitr, and the other is the Eid of the Qurbani. In fact, in many countries, they call it the Qurbani Eid, the sacrifice Eid. Now, what happens is that these goats, sheep, and cows are slaughtered in the most cruel method. It's called halal style. Their throat is slit. They tie the legs of the poor animal, then they slit their throat, and the animal bleeds slowly to death, all the time in agony, kicking its feet, jerking convulsively. And this is the halal style of sacrifice, and the Qurbani, which is done in that style. Every year at the second Eid, millions or billions of animals are killed in that way. So it has come into the common speech when someone threatens somebody, they often say, I will give you as Qurbani. It means I will tie your feet and then slit your throat and let you bleed to death. I will make a Qurbani out of you. So when this man of the Jewish Board of Deputies said we should offer up Jeremy Corbyn as a Qurban, that was the real implication of it. That they would slit his throat, let him bleed, and offer him up to their god, their Moloch. And that is that's a very nasty thought, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's this. You see it all the time. I made the comment on Friday's show that the Roald Dahl estate has been sold to Netflix, and this was a BBC article, and it was all about how the Roald Dahl estate, the money that it makes generally every year, and how Netflix are going to be, they own it all now, so they're going to be making new films and all different sort of stuff based on the work of Roald Dahl. And then the very final line of the whole article, it said, Roald Dahl's family apologised last December for anti-Semitic comments he made in 1983 and 1990. So wherever you see it now, they will put anywhere that they can. They've just put that little flex in. Don't say anything about us, otherwise we'll come after you. And again, it's this elite group at the top that don't want to be criticised. And why, when all we hear about is don't say this, don't say that, hate speech, all this sort of nonsense that they come out with, but we still have free speech. It's not hate speech. That little caveat they inserted quietly a few years ago. Why is it that nothing happened to this guy when he said something pretty... I didn't know until he told me about what this method of sacrifice was, but nothing will happen to him. And the woman even recognised that the chair, she actually said, not only, I just need to remind you you're being live streamed, and then she followed that up, and I want to remind all speakers that they are being live streamed. So that, for me, was her saying, look, you shouldn't say something like that, we might get into trouble. Well, they didn't get into trouble, and the question has to be asked, why, if you or I were to say something like that, would we not have got into trouble ourselves? I think we know the answer. Maleficus, any comments, and then hand back to Frank?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, they certainly, that was incitement to hatred by their own definition, without doubt. In fact, seriously so. When it comes to this whole free speech thing, I would direct anyone back to Rowan Atkinson's talk on free speech, whereby he said what we actually need in order for speech to be truly free, regardless of whether we like what someone is saying or not. If we have offensive speech, the only way that it will be cured in society is to have more of it. Therefore people build up an immunity to these certain things, and they don't have to bury their head under the duvet so that they can't be offended by something that somebody said. No, we need more freedom of speech. We need more offensive speech in order that society, as I've said before, society can govern for itself what it deems acceptable or not. It's not down to a few small people, a handful of people at the very top of who consider themselves at the top of the food chain, to decide on the behalf of society what is acceptable or not. It is down to the society itself to work out what is acceptable and what isn't.
Maleficus, you could say all that in a single sentence. It is, I believe it was the Roman philosopher Seneca, the tutor to the Emperor Nero, who said, "A slave is he who is afraid to speak his thoughts."
Yeah, that's a good one. And there was another one, I think it was Cicero, who said, if we're not afraid to think it, we should not be afraid to speak it.
So basically what's happening is people are afraid to speak. When they do speak, they end up apologizing due to some threat, some punishment. And the white peoples have become slaves. They're afraid to speak their thoughts, to speak their minds. Anyway, I wanted to continue on to the next part. I got one person who wanted to have his opinion expressed on your show. His name is Reese Edgington. Reese as in R-E-E-S-E, and then Edgington. And his message to me was, one thing that I wanted to discuss was your correct take on Nancy Grace. But in addition to how she licked both cheeks of her Zio masters, did you know that they brought her back on TV just this week to cover the story about the young woman who disappeared while traveling with her boyfriend? That has been on the news all week, actually. So I'm trying to think of the name of that, but it's been on American and Canadian TV.
Petito is the surname of the woman. I think Petito is her surname.
You're right. Absolutely right. So the message continues, and I can tell you the deep state had this story run 24/7 on all networks as national news, despite the fact that it involved the tragic death and disappearance of only one white woman. This was done to overshadow the much larger story of Biden's massive blunder in his botched Afghan retreat and turning over $86 billion in high-tech weaponry to the Taliban and ISIS militants, and his follow-up blunder of killing 10 innocent Afghan aid workers, 7 of which were children. So they rolled out their, I'm just reading it as it comes, so they rolled out their ass-sucking whore, Nancy Grace, and gave her a makeover and a $200 hair perm, as she, with great interest and great emotion, went over every scintilla of detail in the young woman's disappearance. That's the comment that this gentleman wanted to be read out. And there I finish with my follow-up on the last show, and I can continue with the story of the American involvement in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Shall I get started?
Yes, please go ahead, Frank.
Now, for a long time, as I said, the Jew supremacist movement has two prime goals, two overriding primary goals. One is to replace the white peoples with colored peoples for complex reasons that we can't go into here. And the second is to establish a base and a strong state in the Middle East, which can be a refuge and a headquarters for ruling over the white world. And that base is, of course, Israel. Now, the whole matter of 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and the 9/11 wars that came afterwards, and the occupation of Afghanistan, springs from the second part, from the second prime goal. And this goes back a long way. Of course, they've been thinking in terms of expanding Israel for a long time, but I'll pick out but of course, the ordinary white is not allowed to know. If the ordinary white has no idea of the names I'm going to mention, they're known to you, Andy, and to you, Maleficus, I'm sure, but the ordinary white has no idea. And the few books that have come out on the subject are not read because the ordinary white doesn't read much, and these books are suppressed to a large extent. In fact, if some gentleman went on the mainstream TV and tried to discuss the planning, the motives, the strong urge of the Jew supremacists to get American and British and French people to go and beat up the Arabs for the benefit of Israel, that item would vanish from the TV screen. That gentleman's face would vanish from the TV screen as swiftly as a cheesecake from the lap of Michael Moore. So it's though there are books on the subject, I think it worthwhile for us to inform the audience and spread it about the intellectual, the planning and the propaganda and the swindles. And I'll start with the ideas of one Oded Yinon. That's Y-I-N-O-N. So he wrote an article in which he spoke to his fellow Jew supremacists. And of course, he spoke in doublespeak, which I'll talk about later on. But he wrote this article, which is often called the Zionist Plan for the Middle East. Now, Yinon was an Israeli journalist and was formerly attached to the Foreign Ministry of Israel. And this article actually got that he was circulating among his fellow supremacists. It got out into the public arena because of the efforts of the Association of Arab American University Graduates. And they actually describe it pretty well. And I'll read the association's summary. The Association of Arab American University Graduates finds it compelling to inaugurate its new publication series, Special Documents, with Oded Yinon's article, which appeared in Kivunim, translation, Directions. Kivunim is the journal of the Department of Information of the World Zionist Organization. So, as you see, this is quite an important document. It was published by the World Zionist Organization. And they published it in February 1982. It's called The Zionist Plan for the Middle East. Yinon is an Israeli journalist and was formerly attached to the Foreign Ministry of Israel. To our knowledge, this is to the knowledge of the association, this document is the most explicit, detailed, and unambiguous statement to date of the Zionist strategy in the Middle East. Furthermore, it stands as an accurate representation of the vision, air quotes, for the entire Middle East of the presently ruling regime, the ruling Zionist regime of Begin, Sharon, and Eitan. Its importance, hence, lies not in its historical value, but in the nightmare which it presents. The Association of Arab American University Graduates continues. The plan operates on two essential premises. To survive, Israel must, 1, become an imperial regional power, and 2, must effect the division of the whole area, the whole Middle East, into small states by the dissolution of all existing Arab states. Small here will depend on the ethnic or sectarian composition of each state. Now, between you and me, Andy and Maleficus, we know how Libya, for example, has turned into an anarchic collection of tribes fighting each other without any national integrity. And that was just my side comment. So you can see this plan is being implemented pretty well. Consequently, the Zionist hope is that sectarian-based states become Israel's satellites and, ironically, its source of moral legitimation. This is not a new idea, nor does it surface for the first time in Zionist strategic thinking. Indeed, fragmenting all Arab states into smaller units has been a recurrent theme. This theme has been documented on a very modest scale in the AAUG publication, Israel's Sacred Terrorism, 1980, by Livia Rokach, R-O-K-A-C-H. Based on the memoirs of Moshe Sharet, former Prime Minister of Israel, Rokach's documents in convincing detail the Zionist plan as it applies to Lebanon and as it was prepared in the mid-50s. So that is the summary by the Association of Arab American Students. And I'll very briefly run through what the article actually says. What does Oded Yenan say? A strategy for Israel in the 1980s. Breaking Egypt down territorially into distinct geographical regions is the political aim of Israel in the 1980s on its Western Front. And then he goes on to really recommend that Israel needs to regain Sinai, which it gave away in a peace deal. It needs to regain Sinai and its oil fields. Then he continues. The vision of a Christian Coptic state in Upper Egypt, alongside a number of weak states with very localized power and without a centralized government as to date, is the key to a historical development which was only set back by the peace agreement, but which seems inevitable in the long run. My comment here, well, it's not even inevitable unless you start some subversive moves and send the Mossad in to finance certain groups and then break up Egypt. This is doublespeak. When he says it seems inevitable, it just means let's do it. Let's create a Christian Coptic state in Upper Egypt and create some weak states with very localized power. Well, he continues. Iraq. Now, this is important because the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a prime goal of 9/11. Iraq, rich in oil on the one hand and internally torn on the other, is guaranteed as a candidate for Israel's targets. Its dissolution is even more important for us than that of Syria. Iraq is stronger than Syria. In the short run, it is Iraqi power which constitutes the greatest threat to Israel. So he goes on, every kind of inter-Arab confrontation will assist us in the short run and will shorten the way to the more important aim of breaking up Iraq into denominations, as in Syria and in Lebanon. I am hearing a lot of Skype noises.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from. Maleficus, I was getting Frank bouncing from one earphone to the other, but it might be my earphones. Could you hear him okay? Maleficus, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I heard him absolutely fine, and the noises sound like something being plugged in and unplugged from Windows.
That's it. Yeah.
That's not coming from my end. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just continue. So
that might be to do with my headphones then. So sorry about that. Hopefully that'll be okay. Otherwise, I'll get another set. Please continue, Frank.
In Iraq, a division into provinces along ethnic and religious lines, as in Syria during Ottoman times, is possible. So here is Oded Yanan saying divide Iraq into provinces. So 3 or more states will exist around the 3 major cities, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. And Shiite areas in the south will separate from the Sunni and Kurdish north. Then he goes on to Jordan. There is no chance that Jordan will continue to exist in its present structure for a long time, and Israel's policy, both in war and in peace, ought to be directed at the liquidation of Jordan under the present regime and the transfer of power to the Palestinian majority. He referring to the Palestinian refugees who fled Palestine in the face of Israeli terrorism. Changing the regime east of the river means Jordan, will also cause the termination of the problem of the territories densely populated with Arabs west of the Jordan. Translation, we're going to kick the Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza and throw them into Jordan. Whether in war or under conditions of peace, emigration from the territories and economic demographic freeze in them, the territories being the West Bank and Gaza, are the guarantees for the coming change on both banks of the river. And we ought to be active in order to accelerate this process in the nearest future. So there we have a man writing an article that has been implemented ever since, writing back in February 1982 for Israel to achieve the fragmentation of the surrounding Arab states into anarchic little statelets and tribes. And that has in fact happened. So you can see the planning that preceded 9/11 was going on for a long time. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, that is very interesting. When you look at all this business with the so-called Arab Spring, and you look at Egypt as well, all these different countries that they destabilised and had revolutions, and what my understanding is of Colonel Gaddafi, demonised as he was over time, is that he actually used a lot of money for his own people. And I actually had a lady on from Libya who'd met Gaddafi, knew some of his sons as well. And, he was well loved by his people. And when you look at Libya under Gaddafi, it was like a first world nation. And then you look at it now. But he wanted to use money for his people. And the powers that should not be didn't want that. And he had to go anyway. And you look at all the other areas like Iraq, all these different areas. And the one that seems to be left is Iran. And that's an interesting case because they're demonised a lot. But there's something not quite right about it. There's a guy called Brendan O'Connell, who is a journalist from Australia, and he got a job. I'm just relaying what he said on his show. This is what he said. I haven't verified it, but I've had him on the show before, and he seemed, genuine to me. He got offered a job with Press TV Iran, and he went over there and worked there, and they didn't want to talk about political Zionism at all. Oh, no, you can't go there. And stuff like that. And he found it to be a very controlled environment, so he left. And I think he went back to Malaysia. That's the last I knew where he was. So that's an interesting one, how they're constantly demonised, but nothing seems to happen to them. A bit like Saudi Arabia as well. There's rumours as to the origins of the Saudi royal family. Well, they always seem to be left alone as well, even though they're blamed for the 9/11 attacks, which, we know there are other people behind them than that, but it's too short a show to go into that. So that would be my comments. Maleficus, any comments, and then please hand back to Frank.
Division for dissolution, and that's what's happening on a worldwide basis as well. And I'll just pick up on one other point that you made there, Frank, or one other point that was made in the article. the gentleman that wrote it was saying, whether it be in times of war or peace, these are our goals and this is what we will work towards. Well, in that respect, is this nation ever at peace? It always seems to be at war with everyone over everything. The ferment, the trouble that is being stirred up everywhere. Are these people ever at peace? I don't think they are.
I'd say there's a lot of validity to that. So I'll continue, and before I continue, I have to mention the term doublespeak, and to use the words of a certain brother Nathaniel Kapner, Talmudic doublespeak. He means doublespeak that follows instructions or the style of the Talmud. And why do people use doublespeak? It is because they often have to speak to their own allies and other Jew supremacists. Say a Jew supremacist in England wants to give an instruction to the Jew supremacist in Australia. He has to often go to a website or make a broadcast which other people will hear. But he speaks in doublespeak so that his fellow Jew supremacist knows exactly what he wants, while he appears to the audience, to white people who might happen to listen. He'll appear to them as speaking about defensive measures, about why somebody else would want to do this, or this thing is inevitable. When he says it's inevitable, he means to his fellow conspirators know that he means, oh, we got to achieve this. We're going to make this inevitable. So Talmudic doublespeak will appear in a lot of the articles, in the two articles I'm going to review. I saw an example of doublespeak when I saw an interview on the Chris Matthews show. Now, Chris Matthews, the very white, very blonde, Nordic-looking man, had a show on MSNBC, a Jew supremacist channel, and Chris Matthews was very deferential, as he always was. The white traitor, bumsucker, whatever. And he was interviewing Michael Ledeen, the chief of the American Enterprise Institute, which is not American in content at all. If anything, is, in my view, anyway, it's anti-American. And Michael Ledeen was urging that they must totally, we have to totally smash the Palestinians. You can't just have a peace or an agreement. The only way to get peace is to totally smash the enemy. We totally smashed and reduced the Germans to rubble and defeated them, reduced them to a conquered people. And only then did we have real peace. And in a similar way, we must smash the Palestinians. You notice how he said we? Now, an American listening might think he's talking to us Americans. We must smash the Palestinians. But common sense tells you that the Palestinians have done nothing to America, no harm. So why would we smash them? Well, his Talmudic listeners knew exactly what he's saying. And then he said that the trouble with the Palestine problem is that they're getting help from all around. They're getting help from their neighbors, from Iran, Iraq, Syria. They're supplying money, food, weapons to the Palestinians. We need to invade these countries and do regime change in these countries. We, once again, there's the doublespeak, we need to. On the one hand, he's implying that we Americans need to do it and inciting them to do it. On the other hand, he's really saying we, the Jew supremacists, need to do it. So you supremacists sitting in Melbourne and the other one sitting in Auckland, note that what we need to do. We need to promote regime change by way of US invasion. And Chris Matthews respectfully said, so you want regime change in all three countries? And Michael Ledeen said, yes, the faster the better. And Chris Matthews, it was clearly understood, he means that America has to invade these countries, didn't affect a citizen's arrest for this man for being a traitor to America, for wanting to sacrifice American lives for an Israeli and Jewish girl. He didn't affect a citizen's arrest, instead he nodded approvingly. And that's the state of the country. So, having discussed the issue of Talmudic doublespeak, I now turn to something more that came later in 1996. It was a document commissioned by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and he commissioned it from an American group, mainly American Jews, and the study group was led by Richard Perle, P-E-R-L-E. Richard Perle, that's a name that will appear over and over because he was a central figure in pushing America to wage wars in the Middle East. And the document is called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And it was prepared by the Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies. And it announces, this document, that the main substantive ideas emerge from Richard Perle, James Colbert, Charles Fairbanks, Douglas Feith, Robert Lovenberg, David Wurmser, W-U-R-M-S-E-R, and Merav Wurmser. I presume they are husband and wife, maybe. But I'd like you to note the name Douglas Feith, F-E-I-T-H, because Douglas Feith was a major figure in 9/11. In fact, he was moved in to have a senior position in the Pentagon and the Defense Department just prior to 9/11. So the very people who proposed these ideas, these very dangerous ideas, ended up in positions of influence. But I'll go into that later. And let us look at this strategy that they proposed to Benjamin Netanyahu, this clean break, meaning a new start, so a completely new strategy. So it said, what did they recommend? And I'm reading from the document now. Work closely with Turkey and Jordan to contain, destabilize, and roll back some of its most dangerous threats. This implies a clean break from the slogan comprehensive peace to and note this, to a traditional concept of strategy based on balance of power. What that means is forget peace, and a strategy based on a traditional concept of strategy based on balance of power means traditional as in the sense of Genghis Khan or of the Assyrian Empire of blood and iron. Sheer iron fist, total military force, change over, a clean break with the past peace process and go to straight punching the enemy, running a sword through them. So that after the Talmudic doublespeak, that's what emerges. Balance of power really means no balance of power. We have the total power. The next thing they recommend, change the nature of its relation with the Palestinians, including upholding the right of hot pursuit for self-defense into all Palestinian areas, and nurturing alternatives to Arafat's exclusive grip on Palestinian society. So that means we can send the army into the Israeli army into every Palestinian area, no problem. Forge a new basis for relations with the United States, stressing self-reliance, maturity, strategic cooperation on areas of mutual concern, and furthering values inherent to the West. This can only be done if Israel takes serious steps to terminate aid, which prevents economic reform. Now, when I look at that and when they say stressing self-reliance, the only self-reliance they can have is to have enough territory that will contain oil, minerals, and farmland. It means if we make Israel expand and take over, as they often said, from the Nile River to the Euphrates, then they will become the next superpower. And of course, they're assuming that by that time they will have rotted and corroded and divided the United States into becoming a failed state. Are you there?
Yeah, I just heard some background noise of a car. I don't think it was at this end, but yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll continue. Early adoption of a bold new perspective on peace and security is imperative for the new Prime Minister. While the previous government may have emphasized land for peace, it placed Israel in the position of retreat, culturally, economic, political, and military retreat. They want to get away from land for peace. The new government will have a new approach, which includes peace through strength and self-reliance. The balance of power. So peace through strength means we'll have the peace of the graveyard. Okay? Once we have the peace of the graveyard, that's peace, but we've killed all the enemy and thrown them into graves. Now that's what they're recommending. Forget land for peace and have peace through strength. And they're saying balance of power, which means the other side has no power. Then they continue. Who are the targets of this move? Syria challenges Israel on Lebanese soil. An effective approach would be if Israel sees the strategic initiative along its northern borders by engaging Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran as the principal agents of aggression in Lebanon. So engaging them means, of course, attacking them. Striking Syria's drug money, of all things. I didn't even know there was any. And its counterfeiting infrastructure in Lebanon. Paralleling Syria's behavior by establishing the precedent that Syrian territory is not immune to attacks emanating from Israeli proxy forces, which means we'll attack Syrian territory and Syria with proxy forces. Striking Syrian military targets in Lebanon, and should that prove insufficient, striking at select targets in Syria proper. So way back in 1982, they were talking about striking at targets in Syria, and of course they're doing it now every day. They bomb Syria practically every day, have been doing so for some years, and that was only possible after the US invaded Iraq. So they continue, the clean break document. Given the nature of the regime in Damascus, that's in Syria, it is both natural and moral that Israel abandon the slogan comprehensive peace and move to contain Syria, drawing attention to its weapons of mass destruction program. Now, you notice that phrase, drawing attention to weapons of mass destruction? That's exactly what George Bush did, the puppet George Bush. He drew attention to the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and then invaded it. George Bush may have yapped about weapons of mass destruction, but he was a marionette speaking the words of his Jew supremacist puppet masters, among them the authors of this article, Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith. So, there's a little bit, now I'll just finish what I was saying and then have comment. Israel can shape its strategic environment by weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. Well, my comment, the CIA, which is now alien-controlled, has been pumping billions of dollars into Syria for the last 15 years, creating a civil war there, containing it, weakening it, rolling it back, whatever. American money and American weapons have gone into Syria in pursuance of this document. But the document continues. This effort can focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right. But then comes the doublespeak, as a means of foiling Syria's regional ambitions. So there's the doublespeak. First they say it's an important Israeli objective, but then they say we are doing it to foil another devil. We are angels. We are foiling the Syrian devil and its regional ambitions. That's the Talmudic doublespeak. But doublespeak or not, they have clearly told the Israeli prime minister that we must focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. More important, it is understandable that Israel has an interest supporting diplomatically Turkey's and Jordan's actions against Syria. That means he is the enemy. And then they go on to talk about the Hashemites. Now, who are the Hashemites? Well, the Jordan is ruled by a man of the Hashemite tribe. First there was the king Hussein. He was a bumsucker of first the British and then the Israelis. He cooperated with Israel even before it was born. And then there is his son, who looks like an obedient son-in-law as he sits before American presidents. They're a family, the Hashemite dynasty, is a kind of 2 or 3 generations of bumsuckers, the perfect tool for the Jew supremacists who wrote this article. And they're saying, were the Hashemites to control Iraq, which means, why don't we install a Hashemite king over Iraq? Were the Hashemites to control Iraq, they could use their influence over Najaf, whatever that is, to help Israel wean the South Lebanese Shia away from the Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria. The Shia retain strong ties to the Hashemites. The Shia venerate foremost the Prophet's family, the direct descendants of which is King Hussein. So they really like King Hussein of Jordan, the Hashemite king, and they want him to rule over parts of the Arab world, Iraq, and especially the Shia of Iraq. They want to install this Hashemite, what they call kingship traitor, over the Shiite part of Iraq. So they end up. Israel's new agenda can signal a clean break by abandoning a policy which assumed exhaustion and allowed strategic retreat by, note the words, re-establishing the principle of preemption rather than retaliation alone, and by ceasing to absorb blows to the nation without response. So what's the main part of that sentence? They want to re-establish the principle of preemption. Now, preemptive war is generally aggressive war, because you're saying I'm going to launch the war beforehand, before I'm attacked. So it's basically aggressive war. There are very few justifications for preemptive war, but that's what they are proposing. Clean break means we are going to wage aggressive war all over the place. And the participants in the study group, they list that Richard Pearl, P-E-R-L-E, American Enterprise Institute. Well, there's that rat's nest, James Colbert, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. Charles Fairbanks, Johns Hopkins University / SAIS. SAIS, I presume, is the acronym for some stink tank, for some subversive organization. Douglas Feith, F-E-I-T-H, Feith and Zell Associates. I wonder what that firm did. Robert Loewenberg, President, Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies. Jonathan Torop, T-O-R-O-P, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. David Wurmser, Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies. And Meirav Wurmser, Johns Hopkins University. So that was the document, A Clean Break. And I took some time over it because it was the document that led directly to the move to plunge the Western world into wars in the Middle East. And now, I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, both Andy and Maleficus, so I will belt up for a minute.
Thank you, Frank, and I don't know if my sound is okay. I've actually changed headphones over, but it sounds
I hear you well.
That's good. Okay, but if there was any background noise at the moment, I'm not sure if I have clicked the mute button, but I'm not sure if I'm actually being muted or if I'm not being muted, which is a bit concerning. But we're coming towards the end of the show anyway, so I'd like to. I've written about this in my book as well. It's an extremely important document, and as you say, Frank, it was needed in order to get all this destabilisation of the Middle East going, which was, built upon that Oded-Yinon plan that you started off with. So I appreciate the heritage, the line that you've drawn for us, where it started, how it developed, and what we can see the final result to have been. But that being said, Maleficus, over to you for any comments.
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot to sort of go through there. I mean, for instance, the more traditional approach of balance of power. A little excerpt from the protocols. We have in our the weapons in our hands are limitless ambitions, burning greediness, merciless vengeance, hatred, and malice. So, when they're talking about re-establishing the principle of preemption, you're exactly right. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about we'll just jump in there first before anyone has the chance to work out what we're up to, if it suits our goal. That's essentially what it means. And as you say, with the double speak, how they can use the words natural and moral when it comes to dealing with countries like Syria and what they're doing over there. What right has anyone got to interfere with the actions of a sovereign nation whose, whether the regime has been voted in by the people or not, it's nothing to do with the surrounding countries or any other country in the world. So, peace through strength, i.e., let's get in there and start leveling the place and disrupting, the citizenship. So in the end, they'll be crying out for regime change because they'll just want it all to stop. Also, not forgetting that this furthers what we were talking about on the last show, which is essentially the Kalergi plan of displacing all these poor and using, shall we say, Israeli proxy forces, which I take to mean actually any military force that is associated with the UN. So that would be British, French, American, using these forces to bomb the hell out of all these poor citizens in their country and create a refugee problem so that they can flood these poor people, whether they want to leave their countries or not. Flood these poor people into Europe and Britain. So, and you also talked about the use of weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, we still didn't find any of those, did we? And we still have the likes of Tony Blair now, who advocated the whole weapons of mass destruction nonsense, who, essentially, egg on face. Those things never turned up. We never found weapons of mass destruction over there, but we still have the likes of Tony Blair influencing decisions like vaccine passports and discrimination against those that are being choosing not to be vaccinated. So why are we still listening to these people? As the public, and I know that's a rhetorical question again, but it just goes to show that the power that the media and these people who consider themselves at the top of the food chain, it just goes to show how much power they wield over people who are just not prepared to think for themselves and think outside the box. Very interesting document, and I obviously I'm going to actually have a good look into that myself, because that's the first time I've actually heard a lot of that information. So the mind boggles. But yeah, thanks for that, Frank. That was really interesting.
Well, you mentioned Tony Blair, and his next job after having engineered that war and swindled the British people, gulled them into that war, his next job was to be the negotiator for the European Union in the Palestine-Israel dispute. And the Palestinians told him to get out because he talked exactly like an Israeli diplomat.
Yeah. Was he not? He was an envoy for peace or something, was he?
Well, he was being highly paid to be the negotiator for the European Union. And the Palestinians said, you know what, you sound just like an Israeli. Why don't you take your smirking, mincing, prancing body out of here?
Yeah. I couldn't have put it better myself.
So I'll just comment here that you might notice that all those foundations and think tanks, I'll call them stink tanks. There's a rat's nest of such foundations and institutes that are working day and night to subvert and use Western countries and white peoples. I read off a few there. And you can see that there are so-called scholars who are highly paid and they work day and night dreaming up wicked and crafty trickeries. And there are rich men and corporations that pay for them and fund them. This huge spider's web of foundations and think tanks. It's almost like a state within a state. It's a frightening phenomenon, almost as alarming as the prospect of running into Whoopi Goldberg on a nudist beach.
I don't know whether it's quite that horrific, Frank. Oh dear, that's hilarious.
But if people want to regain their freedom, they have to address this shadowy state within a state, these institutions that are working to destroy, subvert, and rot and corrupt everything. And we named a few of them: the American Enterprise Institute, the Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. These are traitorous institutions that have sent thousands of Americans to die, to have caused trillions in treasure, the diverted resources in a country that has tent cities, that now people are starving in tent cities.
In order for that to happen, though, Frank, people have to stop looking at what I call the babysitter in the corner of their living room. Stop carrying around their surveillance in their back pocket because, they might need to phone Granny while they're in the middle of shopping. I mean, this whole thing, the reason that people are acquiescing to this is because they've got too comfortable and don't want their creature comforts taken away. I have a friend in Serbia, a good friend in Serbia. He's a lovely, lovely guy, and he's a similar age to me. So I'm in my mid-40s, and when I said to him about all this stuff that's going on around the world, particularly with the COVID thing, he said, you guys have had it too easy for too long and you've grown soft.
Yeah, who can argue with that?
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could go on for a bit, for another half hour, or is that possible, or what?
Yeah, I can. I mean, how about you, Maleficus? You able
Yeah,
to?
that's fine with me. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, because we need to at least leave the audience with a complete segment. So I'll go on to another gentleman who is important, and his article, which is important. This gentleman's name is Philip Zelikow, Zelikow. Philip Zelikow is a major figure in 9/11, as I think. And he wrote an article which certainly foreshadowed a lot of the stuff, 1998. And the article is called Catastrophic Terrorism, Elements of a National Policy, by Ashton B. Carter, John M. Deutsch, and Philip D. Zelikow. So 1998, we are getting pretty close to 2001 now. And the article, as I said, is Catastrophic Terrorism, Elements of a National Policy. And this section is called Imagining the Transforming Event. Now that is an interesting phrase, transforming event, because that's what was talked about later regarding 9/11, a transformative event. So what does this article say? I'm going to read from the article. What is certainly new is that terrorists may today gain access to weapons of mass destruction. There you go, once again, weapons of mass destruction. A phrase that, by the way, I first heard in 1996, when there was an act called the Defense Against Weapons of Mass Destruction Act of 1996. Most people knew it by the name of the congressman, as the something or other amendment named after some congressman. But in 1996, I think one subtitle of the act was Defense Against Weapons of Mass Destruction Act. So anyway, in 1998, this article is saying terrorists may gain access to weapons of mass destruction, shades of George Bush and Tony Blair. These can come in a variety of forms: nuclear explosive devices, germ dispensers, poison gas weapons. An act of catastrophic terrorism that killed thousands of or tens of thousands of people and or disrupted the necessities of life for hundreds of thousands or even millions would be a watershed event in American history. It could involve loss of life and property unprecedented for peacetime and undermine Americans' fundamental sense of security within their own borders. So now here's the important part. Constitutional liberties would be challenged as the United States sought to protect itself from further attacks by pressing against allowable limits in surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and the use of deadly force. Now that's the Talmudic doublespeak. If it happened, constitutional liberties would be challenged. They'd remove the limits on surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and the use of deadly force. It's almost saying that one of the goals of such a catastrophic terrorism would be to clamp down a police state upon the United States and presumably upon other countries. More violence would follow, either as other terrorists seek to imitate this great success, or as the US strikes out at those considered responsible. Gee, didn't we strike out at Afghanistan? That's my comment. Continuing with the article, like Pearl Harbor. And there I'm saying like Pearl Harbor. Interesting, because that's exactly the phrase used in the cover-up document, the Project for a New American Century. Like Pearl Harbor, such an event would divide our past and future into a before and after. The effort and resources we devote to averting or containing this threat now in the before will seem woeful, even pathetic, when compared to what will happen after. Our leaders will be judged negligent for not addressing catastrophic terrorism more urgently. Now, the brunt and burden of this article is that we should immediately set up a few organizations for counterterrorism, which would have wide powers and which would consider doing surveillance of people and how to swiftly arrest people, that kind of thing. We need very strong organizations for counterterrorism, and we need to spend a lot of money on it. So that's the brunt of the article. But I note here the idea that, gee, if such an event happened, a Pearl Harbor type event, some catastrophic terrorist act, constitutional liberties could be suspended. So Philip Zelikow, who was the, I think, prime writer of this and presented here as one of three writers, appears very prominent later on in 9/11. So all these people who appeared in 9/11, they were certainly thinking up the idea, dreaming up wickedness long ago. So, Andy, what do you say to this article?
Yes, it is, again, very, very interesting, and I think he had a prominent role in the 9/11 Commission as well. Someone else had mentioned him. It's always very difficult to find all this information out because they keep scrubbing it. But I had a guest on recently, Misha Popov, who was talking about this guy when we did our 9/11 special, and that'll still be on the website, folks, so you can delve into what he had to say about that on with regard to Zelikow on that show for some further information that I can't quite recall now. But yeah, it's just amazing, all this intrigue and behind the scenes double dealing that goes on, when really, you know, the three of us, we're just the peaceful people who want to get on with our lives. We don't want to impose our will on other countries and what have you. We just want to be able to be free to live our lives in a peaceful manner in our country. But the people who seem to rise to the top are the people who want the absolute opposite. Maleficus, over to you for your comments, and please hand back to Frank.
Yeah, okay, well, so constitutional liberties may be challenged. Yes, of course. Well, the question I'll put to, and again, it's a rhetorical question, but the question I'll put to you guys in the audience is, who stands to gain from all these terrorist attacks? When we had 7/7 bombings over here, whereby we had bombs going off on tube trains or on the underground, and on London buses, and we just happened to have an exercise going on for those very events in the very right, in all the right places at exactly the same time that it occurred. So these exercises, inverted commas, had to be turned into real-time events as they unfolded. When we had some guy a couple of years back driving a car across the London Bridge, running over people, and this was a supposed terrorist attack. Who stands to gain when all this happens? Like Pearl Harbor, a catalyst event in order to bring about a before and after scenario. This is no different to 9/11. And as we know, Pearl Harbor was contrived anyway. They knew we'd broken the Japanese codes. They knew the Japanese were coming. It was done to get American backing, public backing for putting troops over in Europe. Again, for Europeans to blow the hell out of each other. For whose gain? For whose gain? And the last thing I will say on this subject, particularly with 9/11, Blackbird 9, who is another host, I don't know whether you've heard of him, Frank, but he does absolutely sterling work. He covered for Giuseppe on 3 of Giuseppe's shows around the 9/11 or just before 9/11 this year. And he covered 3 weeks in a row, and he did a series of shows called 9/11 Was Fake and Gay. And it's the information that he unearths in there is well worth a listen for you guys and for our listeners.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's on a show called The Perfect Triangle on Revolution Radio. So he covered that in the weeks leading up to this year's 9/11, the 3 weeks leading up to that. Very, very good information. And Blackbird 9 himself was actually a victim, one of the first victims of truth, because he was teaching FBI students about telecommunications, and he stated in his classroom that anyone in his class should all know that none of the phone calls from those airplanes could have been made. And I think the story goes he ended up living out of his car. He went from teaching the elite to living in his car. So there we go. That's what happens when you start speaking the truth in the face of these people.
Yes, indeed. So you were asking about Philip Zelikow. He was the chief architect of the 9/11 Commission's report, the Commission's fake report. He actually wrote every heading and subheading of each paragraph, the headings and subheadings. And so that report of lies was masterminded by this man. And it's interesting that I read now that he has also advised the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's program in global development. They seem to always hang together, all these.
That's horrific. I didn't know that. That's absolutely horrific.
Well, it seems to be almost incestuous the way they hang together and pay each other and finance each other. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, now, these are the supremacists talking among themselves and giving instruction to other people. But it seems to me that these supremacists wanted the stupid whites and subject peoples to go and kill some brown people in Israel's neighborhood. But then it might become too obvious that it's supremacists who are doing it, that these are Zionists. Might become too obvious. Why don't we put a white face on it? Why don't we put an American face on it? Say that this is all being done for America. That's the way to handle it. We've got to say that this aggressive move is done by Americans for America. They may be misguided, but it's not done for certain Jew supremacists or for certain Israel firsters. It's being done for America. So what did they do? They pumped up this thing, or they pumped new life into this thing called the Project for a New American Century, PNAC. Project for a New American Century, of course, has a few white faces, like Dick Cheney in it. I'd have to look into it more carefully. But let me read from the very website of the Project for a New American Century. This is the website itself talking. Established in the spring of 1997, pretty close to 2001 and the 9/11 attacks, the Project for a New American Century is a non-profit educational organization. Educational. Did I hear double speak there? Whose goal is to promote American global leadership. So there we are, they're saying we're trying to make America top dog. The project is an initiative of the New Citizenship Project. Another kind of scaffold and blind. William Crystal is chairman, that's Kristol. William Crystal is chairman of the project, and Robert Kagan, Kagan, Devin Gaffney Cross, Bruce P. Jackson, and John R. Bolton serve as directors. Now, John Bolton is, of course, I think he's the notorious John Bolton who was in all these, the negotiator. I think it's the same Bolton. Gary Schmidt is executive director of the project. But I also note, that's on the website, but I believe that Rabbi Dov Zakheim, Zakheim, was also a leading member of the project. Now, Rabbi Dov Zakheim is pretty important, and I believe he was part of this PNAC. And so they published a document, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, a report of the Project for the New American Century, September 2000. Well, we're getting pretty close to 2001, and this puts an American face on it to cover it up. We're not doing this for Israel, we're doing this for America. So what do they say? Generally, increase military spending by a fantastic amount. That's what this document is recommending. And intervene everywhere under the pretext that the US must be the global policeman. That's my reading of the document. It's quite a long document, but that's what I saw. But now I'm going to quote some passages, a passage from the document, hidden among hundreds of passages on the Balkans and just about in South Asia. Here's the important one. Indeed, the United States has for decades sought to play a more permanent role in Gulf regional security. That's the Persian Gulf. While the unresolved conflict with Iraq provides the immediate justification, the need for a substantial American force presence in the Gulf transcends the issue of the regime of Saddam Hussein. So even though the America is there since the first Gulf War, it has to be there anyway. Even if the regime of Saddam Hussein perishes, America had better be in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And then they have this phrase, this sentence, further, and I'm quoting exactly, further the transformation of the military, even if it brings revolutionary change. Now what they mean is that the military had to be quintupled in size or multiplied by a factor of 10. That's what they were recommending. But further, the process of transformation of the military, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So we are back to Pearl Harbor, the original false flag. But they need a catastrophic and catalyzing event. And if anyone should say, gee, that must have been done for the Zionists, they'll say, no, it was being done for the Americans. We are doing this to make America the dominant global power. But that's the exact phrase. The process of transformation of the military, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Kind of reminds you of the article by Zelikov, catastrophic terrorism. So the same words. It seems these guys aren't very original. They actually borrow from, they plagiarize from each other. So then they go on to say, this is the end of it. Sounds suspiciously like a certain precedent. And I'm quoting from the document, we cannot allow North Korea, Iran, Iraq, or similar states to undermine American leadership, intimidate American allies, or threaten the American homeland itself. The blessings of the American peace, purchased at fearful cost and a century of effort, should not be so trivially squandered. And that is the conclusion of this interesting little document. We can't allow North Korea, Iran, Iraq to undermine American leadership. And here I will point out, notice how they use the word American over and over to put an American and white face on this Zionist project. So that was the last article I wanted to review. And now I turn it over to Andy and Maleficus.
Thank you, Frank. And I'm just trying to find a quote from Henry Kissinger. I do believe that I've got it in my book, so bear with me. It's not on that page, but it's basically similar to what you just said there. So I'll see if I can find it. Actually, Maleficus, do you want to go ahead while I try and locate this quote and see if I've got it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the thing is, the whole destabilization of the Middle East, back when we first went into Syria, I say we as in Britain, France, America, we had Russia playing the same shoe on the other foot, saying, oh, we're going to provide support to Syria. Well, why didn't they do what we did in World War II? And that is, no, if you're declaring war on Poland, we're declaring war on you. So that would have, why did Russia not attack Britain or America or whatever? This is a war by proxy, which only serves one state that I can think of offhand, and without. I mean, I don't think I really need to address that huge elephant in the room. I think everyone can see it's there. Undermining American leadership. Yeah, American, and all the time. What this whole plan was, the whole 9/11 plan. I believe when you did your 9/11 show, Andy, there was a filmmaker actually involved back in was it the 70s or the 80s? And they followed. They followed the line. The guy who wrote the film. I'm floundering now, but I'm trying to think back to your 9/11 show.
The Back to the Future. Are you talking about that reference, or?
No, it was some chap who'd written about airlines crashing into skyscrapers, or produced a film about it.
Well, there was the Lone Gunman episode, which was a spin-off of the X-Files, and in the first episode, a plane is hijacked by remote control and flown into the World Trade Center, and they just managed to get control of the plane at the last minute and, lift the nose above it so it doesn't crash in. And that came out, I think, the same year or the year before.
Okay, yeah. Have you found that quote you were looking for?
Yeah, I've got it here. It's not in my book, but I just typed in, because there's a word in it called promulgated, which Frank will no doubt know, but it's something I had to look up when I first heard it. So I just typed in Kissinger quote promulgated into webcrawler.com, and that's a good search engine, and quant.com, QWANT.com, but I think if you put this into Google you get nothing, but it's taken me to a website called libertytree.ca. And Henry Kissinger apparently made this quote at a Bilderberg meeting in Evian, France on May the 21st, 1992. It says, unbeknownst to Kissinger, his speech was taped by a Swiss delegate to the meeting. So this is the quote. Today, Americans would be outraged if UN troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow they will be grateful. This is especially true if they were told that there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated, that threatened our very existence. It is then that all peoples of the world will plead with world leaders to deliver them from this evil. The one thing every man fears is the unknown. When presented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being granted to them by their world government. Sounds just like the COVID business we're going through today, doesn't it? Frank, your comments, and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, that's actually one of the more disturbing things I've heard in a long time. Let's put it that way. It's almost like somebody was planning our future. You know,
I mean,
yes, sir.
Sorry, I was just going to say, there's a phrase or a part of the protocols that says, we shall so wear down the goyim that they will be compelled to offer us world government. I would also like to add that if you spell Evian backwards, it actually spells naive.
Well done. That is very interesting, absolutely. Yeah, and they like to play with words and numbers and things like that, so that is interesting. Frank, have you got
the other
anything?
thing that Evian...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, the other thing that Evian is famous for is the Evian conference when they were deciding what to do with the poor beleaguered Jews in Germany. It was a complete flop because all the countries that attended didn't really want to take on any refugees from Germany. So, yeah, there we go. If we're closing up, I'd just like to make one quick announcement, Andy, and that is I've had quite a lot of emails this week and last week from John and Will, and I haven't actually had a chance to respond to any of them, but I will do in due course, and it would actually be very nice to catch up with them real time, and my Skype is the same as my email, so by all means we'll hopefully manage to hook up. Had quite a lot of good feedback from last week's show as well. So
I needed about 10 minutes to wrap this up, actually. Is that possible or too late?
No, that's fine. Yeah, we can go another 10 minutes. So I'll hand back to you, Frank, and yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So it seems when you look at all these plans and documents, there were three main goals. Use the stupid populations of Western countries to smash the Middle East for the benefit of Israeli expansion. Use the Middle East chaos to create refugee flows into the West and hasten the replacement of the hated whites. And thirdly, to establish a police state upon the US. Now, I'm not getting that from the documents, but from other facts and from other developments. So these three goals have been achieved very well, especially the refugee flows into the West have been horrific, particularly into Germany. There are Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees even here in Canada, in Vancouver Island, in fact, the furthest point away from the Middle East. And the replacement of the hated whites has, of course, been accelerated by that. And the police state that clamped down after 9/11 has been amplified and redoubled ever since then. So, to achieve all these goals, the evildoers enacted 9/11. There's a lot of research done on that. There's no need for me to comment on it. However, I'll note that these so-called scholars, these planners of the evil, they got into seats of executive power at the Pentagon. Now, I say that because I was telling you in the last program that the military has become a tool of these supremacists. Paul Wolfowitz, one of the writers of these documents, arrived on January 20, 2001 and became the number 2 ranked man at the Pentagon. Rabbi Dov Zakheim, of PNAC fame, I believe, arrived on April 4, 2001 as Pentagon comptroller. Comptroller means accountant and auditor, chief accountant. Douglas Feith arrived in July of 2001, became the number 3 man at the Pentagon. Douglas Feith was prominent as proposing all these wars and in these articles and documents. Richard Pearl, another of these luminaries, arrived in 2001 in time for 9/11. Douglas Feith appointed Pearl as the chairman of the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee. In addition, there came one Abraham Shulsky, Shulsky. He created a body called the Office of Special Plans, whose sole purpose was to serve as a lie factory, claiming that Iraq was a hotbed of terrorism against America, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, The Office of Special Plans was the Office of Special Lying. Wikipedia has an interesting take on Abraham Shulsky. Abraham Shulsky is a neoconservative scholar who has worked for US government, RAND Corporation, and the Hudson Institute. He served as director of the Office of Special Plans, a unit whose function has been compared to the 1970s Team B exercise. In the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Shulsky approved OSP memos with talking points about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Shulsky is critical of the traditional intelligence analysis, which is based upon the social scientific method, and of independent intelligence agencies. Shulsky favors a military intelligence model which can be used to support policy as, in Shulsky's words, quotation marks, truth is not the goal, quotation marks closed, of intelligence operations, but, quotation marks, the victory. So Shulsky says that intelligence operations are not used for the goal of truth, but they're used for the goal of victory, which means you've got to lie about the intelligence. So these people not only planned and advocated for these horrific invasions, they inserted themselves into the Defense Department, into the Pentagon in time for 9/11, and were probably critical to the enacting of it. That's my analysis of it. And you might note one thing, that Wolfowitz, Feitz, Zackheim, Pearl, all the other people I mentioned, including Dov Zackheim, they have no military experience whatsoever. And yet there they are sitting in the Pentagon. See the state of Americans. They spend their resources on a huge military, but they have no control over it. The supremacists and Zionists appoint who they like, wherever they like. Even they can appoint people who have no military experience into the Pentagon. They appoint people who are clearly ideologues, whose only ideology is that the Jew supremacists are a master race, and they can use non-Jews like so many cattle. The American people are not even allowed to know who controls their Pentagon and their armed forces. They've been reduced. Their role is to just go bankrupt in funding this obscenely huge military. Yes, the American people are like blind slaves led by the nose, and I wonder who is going to take the blindfold off. I wonder if enough people like us speak up, whether the blindfold will ever come off. And did any white politician protest about this, about the infiltration of the military? Well, a subject people cannot protest. And it's partly because of the character of the senators and congressmen. Only lickspittles and weaklings allowed to rise to office, they're allowed to appear on the media. Only the other day, I saw this Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, speaking about the crisis at the southern border, about the invasion, the hordes of Haitians pouring into the southern border. But he looked apologetic, he looked defensive, he looked like somebody had just beaten him and he needed to assert himself after being beaten. And he was saying that, but it's not racist. People have to understand it's not racist to want to uphold your country's laws. It's not racist to have an effective border. There is a senator claiming to speak for whites, a white man claiming to speak for whites. And he doesn't even claim that. He doesn't even dare to say the word white, but at least he's implying that. And all he can do is quote, repeat the attack word and control word of the enemy, the control word against whites, the control word of racists, a control word that controls them as well as the control words used for dogs, like sit, stay, go pee. And he uses this control word and protests that he's not a racist, which implies, of course, I'm not a patriot for my people. And that's the kind of man who was there in 2001 and did not protest the subversion of the military. That's the kind of man who's allowed to rise to power today. You might say that this Senator John Kennedy and his fellow senators, all the white senators and congressmen, They form a band of convivial spirits that are better known as the fraternity of limp dicks.
I've got a couple of quotes here. One I was looking for because he brought up Dov Zakheim, and another one that I just found that is worth throwing in there based upon your presentation today, Frank, which I thought was fantastic. At the beginning of March 2004, dual Israeli-American citizen and Jewish Rabbi Dov Zakheim resigns as the Pentagon Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer when it is revealed in an audit of the Pentagon budget that he is unable to account for the disappearance of $2.6 trillion, including defence inventory of 56 aeroplanes, 32 tanks and 36 Javelin missile command launch units. Interestingly, the United States government claim this cannot be investigated further because, allegedly, the records which would need to be studied to investigate this matter were destroyed in the attack on the Pentagon on September the 11th, 2001. And the other one, this is from September of 2003. Israeli military historian Martin Levy van Crevold, who is on the faculty of Hebrew University of Jerusalem, is interviewed in a Dutch weekly journal, El Savior, in which he states the following: "We possess several hundred atomic warheads and rockets and can launch them at targets in all directions, perhaps even at Rome. Most European capitals are targets for our air force. Our armed forces are not the 30th strongest in the world, but rather the second or third. We have the capability to take the world down with us, and I can assure you that that will happen before Israel goes under." So that's another reference to the Seymour Hersh's Samson option. I don't know why my mind went blank. You know, where the answer is if Israel looks, if it looks like the world's turning against Israel, then they're going to destroy as many countries as they can, so they won't go down alone. Frank, any final comments, and then we'll wrap it up.
No, I think I'm done. I wondered if Maleficus had something to say.
I will just say one thing about all these Haitian refugees. Who's paying for them all to get there? Isn't there a big expanse of water between Haiti and the American border?
Well, I think a Haitian would sell his family land in order to get his body to the United States. But somebody might be paying them, yeah.
That is interesting. So, well, I want to thank both Frank for being our special guest and Maleficus for joining me today on The Limeys. Folks, you have been listening to Electric Limey Land with special guest Frank Raymond. I want to thank all of you for listening. Have a wonderful day. The Limeys will be back next week. I'll be back with you tomorrow. Until then, folks, bye for now.